Today we're talking about social regulation, and we've discussed the importance of coordinating moods, about using recognize, relax, distract, problem solve to help other people coordinate to deal healthily with their emotions. Next, we're going to talk about the importance of establishing boundaries. Boundaries establish which topics and behaviors are appropriate, and they are vital for healthy relationships of any type. I know it's easy listening to these lectures to think that I'm advocating that you should just be like besties with everyone you work with, and you guys should like have sleepovers and hold hands and like stare longingly into each other's eyes over lunch, or whatever it is. And I am absolutely not recommending that. All of these techniques I'm talking about the emotions that come up in a workplace, in a work setting. I mean, obviously they're applicable in other settings as well, and I hope you use them for that. But when I'm talking about all this like emotional connection and listening to people, I'm talking about specifically with work-related content. Now, you might be working with someone and, maybe you're supervising someone and he's having a really hard time at home for whatever reason, and he's been coming in late to work every day, and you talk to him about it, and he like breaks down and he's like, crying to you for an hour about all his problems, and you feel like kind of compelled to listen or to be there or whatever. You're not his therapist, right? You're not his best friend. And certainly give them, depending on your relationship with that person, give them the time, listen to them. That's important. But ultimately what I'm talking about is you need to understand what's going on to the extent that it's going to impact their work, and what kind of accommodations do you both think is fair given that situation. That's the conversation you should be having with them. You don't have to be there and listen necessarily to all of their personal problems and empathize with all their personal problems and be their best friend. That's not your role, and that's not an appropriate role oftentimes. And so, listen to begin with, and then when appropriate, you can say, okay, I understand you're having a really hard time at home. Let's talk about how this is going to impact your work and what we can do to help you in regard to that, and pivot the conversation to something work-related. Likewise, if you have a coworker that like wants to go to lunch with you every single day and you don't want to do that, that's totally okay, right? You can just tell the coworker like, hey, I enjoy your company, but I like to have my lunches to myself. It's like a time for me to unwind or whatever it is. And that is a perfectly appropriate thing to say to a coworker. It's not rude. It's not inappropriate. You're setting boundaries about what type of behaviors are appropriate or not. Another example of this is we often we often very much dislike people who talk our ear off, right? And that's a lack of setting boundaries. That there's someone in your office that every time you see them, they talk to you for like 10 or 15 minutes, right? And you like start sneaking around corners to avoid them. That's because you're not setting up boundaries. That it is perfectly okay that 5 minutes into a conversation to be like, hey, I'm appreciating talking to you. I just really have to get some work done. Hope you have a good rest of your day. That's a perfectly okay thing to do. That's setting appropriate boundaries. Now, it would be rude if you don't give them any time, right? It's rude not to be willing to give someone 2-3 minutes to listen to their day, and you can decide what you think is appropriate on both ends of that. But it's not rude to come into work and need to get work done. And we think that people won't like this, right? Like we don't like putting up boundaries because we're worried people are going to be upset at us. That's not true. People don't dislike boundaries. People dislike mushy boundaries. People want you to tell them, hey, I enjoy talking to you this much. I'm no longer enjoying talking to you, right? Like we all hate the idea that we're boring someone, and other people hate that as well. And so we are reluctant to put up appropriate boundaries because we feel like we're going to alienate people. But in actuality, the opposite is true. People like knowing what our limits are, and we can be clear about that. Today, we're talking about the importance of social regulation, and we've talked about coordinating moods, using recognize, relax, distract, problem solve to help other people deal with powerful emotional experiences. We've talked about the importance of establishing boundaries. And lastly, we'll talk about the importance of developing these social skills in other people. Every semester when I teach this, I have at least one student who's like, why do I always have to be the mature one? Like, why do I always have to be the patient one and the good listener? And like, why aren't people supposed to be patient with me and good listening with me? And why don't they regulate my emotions? That is a perfectly legitimate question, and the answer is you don't have to always be the more mature one. I usually do this because it's easier than the alternative. This is the least worst way to handle things, in my opinion, and it beats an alternative of going around and always getting in petty fights in your life. The other thing is I genuinely don't think that you should always be the one to do this, and that I don't think there can be a successful relationship where only one person does this type of social regulation, that both people in a relationship, or if you're on a team, all members of a team, need to be able to do it. It is too much of a burden for one person to bear. They cannot. And so especially if you're in a management position, if you're in a leadership position, I think it is one of the key responsibilities to help develop these skills in the people that you work with. Listening skills, feedback skills, persuasion skills, that you need to consciously develop these. And they're skills, right? Just like you teach someone how to use the copier or fax machine or whatever the kids are using these days, you can teach them these emotional skills, and they're very useful. And so I don't think it should always have to be you. I think everyone should have the luxury of occasionally being overwhelmed with emotion and know that the other people in their lives are going to be able to handle that in a healthy and mature way. We're talking about social regulation and relationship management today, and we talked about how you can coordinate moods through emotional contagion and through empathy and through shaping the emotional frame of reference. We talked about how you can help other people handle their powerful emotional experiences with the recognize, relax, distract, problem solve framework, just like we can use with our own emotions. We talked about the importance of establishing healthy boundaries and appropriate boundaries with people. And we talked about the importance of developing these social skills in others so it doesn't always fall on you to handle these powerful emotional situations. And again, I thoroughly apologize for how ugly this PowerPoint is. I'm embarrassed, guys. All right, have a good week.